This is Jack Rice at the United Nations. I'm here with Djankou. He's with the International Labor Organization, the Office for the United Nations, and he's also the representative to the United Nations and the director. Djankou, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Now, as I understand it, we were talking earlier that what you deal with, generally speaking, are labor standards on a worldwide basis. Is that right?
Yes, the ILO cover a broad range of social issues, one of which are labor standards. We, of course, deal with employment, social protection, which include pensions, occupational safety and health, and we also deal with social dialogue, which include interaction with social partners such as trade unions, employers, and of course the Department of Labor, governments. Yeah.
You do this on a worldwide basis. I'm curious how cooperative people are in each individual country. I mean, I try to contemplate if you came into New York or St. Louis or Minneapolis or Los Angeles or Paris or London or any place else, and people would say, well, why should I listen to you? What do you have to tell me? This is our country. What would you say to that?
Well, we have to look at our history. We date back to 1919. That's when the organization was established. We predate the UN. We became part of the UN as specialized agencies after the creation of the UN. And since 1919 until today, the International Labour Organization has been adopting standards that actually are already being implemented in many countries. They affect the lives of working people. They're part of the world labor codes in different countries, but people don't necessarily trace it back to the International Labour Organization. The first ILO standard that was adopted concerns the hours of work. Everybody assumes now 8 hours per day, 40-hour week is sort of something that came from their own government, but that is something that dates back from the first labor standard that was, and so I think related to the minimum age for work, things related to unemployment benefits, safety and health in construction. All these standards are already in place. They are already adopted by many countries. So it's not so much the question of convincing an individual to adopt them as convincing the state to ratify these standards, incorporate them into their national legislation and enforce them as part of the national labor law system. And we do that through our offices in different countries, which are in permanent contact with governments, employers and workers. Actually, one has to keep in mind that it's not a separate entity. We are an organization. I mean, the International Labour Organization has members, and these members are governments and the social partners. So they make the laws. If they make them, it means that they are ready to adopt them.
How hard is it to convince those who haven't adopted those laws to do so? We've seen the stories of international shoe manufacturers who are using child labor in Southeast Asia. We've seen similar things happening in parts of Africa. And these countries are less than willing to cooperate with you. How do you motivate them? How do you motivate the people within these countries to raise their standards, to set a standard and to keep that standard?
Your question suggests that we are trying to convince everybody to adopt everything. No, I think we have to realize that not every standards apply to every country. Some countries are at a certain level of development, which means that certain standards will not be applicable, will actually not even be relevant. I mean, we also have maritime standards, but you can't apply that to a landlocked country. So obviously we would be talking to countries that have,
that would make sense.
But at the same time also, we have what we call the core standards. There are 8 standards that were set apart that represent the basic fundamental human rights standards as applied to the world of work. And these standards are standards that are comprised in a landmark document which was the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. These standards apply to any country regardless of level of development. And I just give them to you. These standards concern freedom of association. These standards concern forced labor, and this standard concerns equality, non-discrimination, and they concern child labor. There are 4 broad categories of human rights: freedom of association, forced labor, non-discrimination, and child labor. These 4 broad categories are represented in the declaration by 8 conventions. These standards, we call them conventions, 8 conventions. Now, these conventions, you can't tell me that because you are at the lower level of development than a given country, you cannot apply the child labor, say therefore children should work. So those standards are those that we are promoting more actively. And I must say, with some success, with a large degree of success from some, it would be amazing to imagine how many governments actually embrace our child labor conventions. Like, there are 2 of them. There are minimum age for employment, and there is the convention on the abolition of the worst forms of child labor: child pornography, child trafficking, bondage, slavery. So these conventions are virtually universally adopted, ratified. So it is less difficult than one can imagine. Obviously, there can be resistances in some cases, like adopting a convention on freedom of association by a country that is a one-party system, like in China, for example. You would have to be very persuasive and gradually work towards it. It's a question of working together with the constituent. It's not a question of imposing.
If I can follow up on that, then. There's a difference between it being ratified and implementing it. Again, I'm just back from Darfur, and I looked into the faces of 10 and 11-year-old boys who were just released from slavery. They had been slaves most of their lives. Well, that goes against everything that you're saying, and yet Sudan, as I recall, was a country who says that slavery doesn't exist. It does. How do you not just ratify, but make sure that it actually sticks?
It is a difficult and uphill battle, and not necessarily only in the case of Sudan or in the case of XYZ country. We are dealing with issues that are very difficult, very sensitive, and we have a mechanism in place at the International Labour Organization, which are what we call the supervisory mechanism for the implementation of standards. Meaning that a country when a country ratifies one of our standards, that country should report back to the ILO on means and ways that they are implementing. If there are violations of these standards, there is a mechanism whereby there can be a case open at the ILO and discussed and reviewed, and there can be conclusion drawn out of this case. I'm summarizing because we don't have so much time to go into the detail. But basically, there is a system in place to monitor the implementation of these conventions. We are dealing with labor conventions. The case of Darfur and Sudan, it's not necessarily something that would enter into our category of labor, because we have conventions that abolish forced labor, child labor. If we have cases of forced labor, child labor, within those general abuses that you are talking about that are real, that can be reported back to the ILO. ILO will take measures within the framework of its supervisory mechanism. They will open the case. There can be direct contact mission to investigate, like we did in the case of Burma. We actually we are one of the rare officers that were called back into Burma to actually be witness to what is going on. So we have an office there that monitors the labor rights situation in Burma. So with international pressure, gradually, I think that there is a lot that can be done. It was done in the case of apartheid in South Africa through a lot of pressure put by ILO and the ILO constituents, that is the trade union. Don't forget, we have trade unions on board, so they monitor the situation in every country, and they take international pressure, international measures, and that can help.